Good afternoon. I've got 12 minutes after 4, so we're 2 minutes late. It's time to start. I'm Rebecca Blank. I'm the Joan and Sanford Weill Dean of the Gerald R. Ford School of Public Policy, and I'm delighted to welcome all of you to the first of 2 Towsley Policymaker in Residence lectures that we're going to have this semester. This is the first of those, and we're here to hear what promises to be just a terrific lecture on one of the more pressing problems facing us within this nation, namely issues of immigration and how we most effectively deal with them in legislation as well as a national community. Our speaker today is Cecilia Muñoz. Cecilia is visiting and teaching at the Ford School this semester as one of our 2 Towsley Foundation Policymaker in Residence people. The Harry A. and Margaret D. Towsley Foundation Policymaker in Residence program was established in 2002 to bring individuals with significant policy-making experience here to campus to interact with students and with faculty. And I want to introduce a few people here, John and Randy Rieker and Judy and Don Rummelhart, who are quite instrumental in helping establish that program. So we thank you for that. I've actually wanted to bring Cecilia here with this program for a number of years. We talked about this, 2-3 years ago in my office, and I'm really pleased that she was able to take a short break from her job and come for a half semester. Cecilia is currently the Vice President for the Office of Research, Advocacy, and Legislation at the National Council of La Raza, a large Hispanic civil rights and advocacy group. It's the Hispanic civil rights and advocacy group, really, at the national level. In 2000, she was awarded the prestigious MacArthur Genius Fellowship by the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation. Prior to joining the NCLR, Muñoz has worked with the Roman Catholic Archdiocese of Chicago as head of their legislative outreach program for Catholic Charities, where she operated field offices that helped undocumented immigrants obtain U.S. citizenship. It is one of the delights always when you have someone here who actually has other connections to the University of Michigan. And Cecilia is the 3rd generation of University of Michigan connections, and she's even got some relatives here who are the 4th generation. She's a graduate of the University of Michigan, grew up just down the road in Livonia. Her family is here today, her sister, her brother, her father, and a couple of nephews, so we're delighted to welcome them as well. Cecilia comes back to the University of Michigan rather frequently. I know she speaks here about every other year or so. And in fact, I first met her in either 2000 or 2001, one of my first years here at the school, when she gave our Martin Luther King lecture that year and did a wonderful job. We are in for a treat today, so I'm very pleased to welcome Cecilia here as our Towsley Policy Foundation Policymaker in Residence for 2007. Cecilia.
Thank you very much. I really should start by thanking the Dean for the opportunity to be here at the Ford School. For me, it's a tremendous opportunity to step back away from the hustle and bustle of the advocacy work that I do in Washington, and to try to view that work from a slightly different perspective, and to be able to interact with the really fabulous faculty here who have been so nice to me and so welcoming, and some really terrific students, many of whom are here even though they have a paper due tomorrow. That's always nice to see. And I'd be remiss if I didn't thank also certainly the Towsley Foundation for this opportunity, and also my family who's here. You've heard that my sister and I are the 1st generation of our family to be born in this country, but the 3rd generation of our family to graduate from the University of Michigan, and we're very proud of that, and of the 4th generation that's sitting right over there. So as you've heard, I come to the Ford School from the National Council of La Raza, where I'm responsible for an advocacy portfolio that includes education, healthcare, economic issues, civil rights, and a whole host of other issues. My particular expertise is on immigration, but I raise those other issues that we work on because they're really the bread and butter of our work. They're the essence of what Latinos care about, and the essence of what we need to work on if we're really going to make our full contribution to this country, and to help our community prosper and the country as a whole prosper. Now, as a civil rights organization, that's essentially what we're about. It's about, for us, achieving equity for our community, and hopefully, therefore, moving the country a little closer towards equity. And I have to point this out because there's so many people who don't buy it, who don't buy that that's what civil rights institutions are about. They see us as pursuing special privileges or programs which are inherently inequitable, when really the whole point of what we're about is trying to achieve equity, economic equity, and social justice. My organization in particular gets challenged, especially in the media, and I'm not just talking about talk radio or Fox News, but even CNN. We get portrayed as a radical, US-hating, brown beret-wearing separatist organization hell-bent on retrieving the southwestern United States from Mexico, which is really silly. But there are a lot of people out there, especially in the media, who believe that that's our secret hidden agenda, and they've managed to persuade some members of Congress that that's our secret hidden agenda. So we find ourselves in the interesting position of having to explain that as Hispanic Americans, we're Americans. This is an American constituency. We're an American institution, and what we're trying to do is a fundamentally American thing. The whole point of being a civil rights institution is not about separation, it's about inclusion. It's about working towards a time when we are fully partners in the American dream, fully incorporated into American society. It's a quintessentially American thing. It expresses a belief that you can work within our social structures, that civil society can engage in a way that moves the country more towards its ideals and towards its highest ideals. When I started at NCLR 18 years ago, Latinos were largely invisible as a community. Our job was really about presenting the data and telling the story about what was going on. Really outside of the Southwest, we were largely invisible, and certainly in policymaking circles in Washington, we were pretty invisible. When you think about it, the 1980 census is the first census that gave us the ability to really tell our story and describe what was going on economically in the Hispanic community, what was going on in terms of our educational status. It was only in 1980 when the census asked the question that would allow us to gather data and really tell the story about what was going on in our community. So our job was to really take that data and begin to tell the story and describe what was happening. Especially, we spent a lot of time and energy focusing on poverty in the community, and then developing policy formulations, policy proposals that would respond to that reality. So if you fast forward to the 2000 census, we're not invisible anymore. And in fact, the results of the 2000 census found that Latinos had become the largest minority in the country. Now, if you know anything about demographic trends, you could see it coming. But most of the country wasn't following demographic trends, and most of the media wasn't following demographic trends. And the way the media portrayed this particular moment when we became the largest minority in the country is really telling. And I'm going to share with you some of the headlines. They're from January 22nd of 2003. So the Washington Post has us, you see the subheadline, we find us outpacing blacks. This demographic moment is actually really about a competition. So they find us outpacing blacks, and the terms that they use is deadlock, right? So they say in 2000 we were deadlocked with African Americans. In 2001 the deadlock was even closer. The same day the Chicago Tribune has us overtaking blacks, and the same day the New York Times has us edging past them. Right? So it's a really interesting way to talk about demographic change. The terminology we're using is the terminology you use for a horse race. Winners and losers, right? Which is a really fascinating way to be talking about demographic change. Well, that series of headlines was followed by about a month of very constant media attention to this issue on television, on the radio, and in newspapers. And the tone of those questions, when it was good, it was about a horse race. And most of the time, it was much more hysterical. It was where did you all come from? And what does it mean for the rest of us that there are so many of you? And what do you intend to do with our country? And as unfortunate as that framing and that tone is, those are very important questions. And they're really the very questions that my institution is about answering. It's our job to answer. What does it mean that the Latino community is such a significant presence in this country? And what do we intend to do with our presence in this country? And the honest answer to that question is really equity. So the Latino agenda, the big scary agenda that the television news tells you is not really the full story, is really here. What we intend to do with whatever political clout we have, with whatever economic clout is we want a decent education for our kids and hopefully for all kids in this country. We want to make sure everyone has access to health care. We're very interested in improving our economic status and the economic status especially of low-wage workers in this country. We want to live in safe neighborhoods, and we want the same respect that any other American would expect for our role and our contributions in this country. So that's all sort of a preamble. You might be wondering why we have to go into all of this if this is a talk that's supposed to be about immigration. And the reason that I raised it and the reason it's relevant is that immigration is probably the single biggest obstacle that we face in accomplishing this agenda. The immigration debate is really characterizing the Latino community in the minds of the U.S. public. And whether we like it or not, it's really defining who we are in their minds, despite the fact that most of us are not immigrants. When I started at NCLR 18 years ago, about 70% of the Latino community was native-born to 30% foreign-born. Those numbers have shifted. We're now at about 60-40, but the majority of Latinos are natives of the United States. About 40% of us are foreign-born. This is an American constituency in a nation of immigrants. But the immigration debate has characterized us in a way which makes it hard to get at this particular agenda. To give you an example, last year a reporter from one of those shows on CNN, not Lou Dobbs, who is right now spending a lot of time tackling immigrants, but this was actually Anderson Cooper's program. And they came into our office and sat down, and the first question was, explain to us why the growth in the Latino community is not a bad thing for the country. And I thought he was talking about immigrants, so I asked him, do you want me to talk about whether immigrants are a good thing for the country or not? He said, no, explain to me why the growth in Latinos isn't a bad thing. Now take the word Latinos out of that sentence and add any other group, and you can begin to see that that is maybe questionable as a question. And his follow-up question wasn't any better. He said, aren't your kids a burden in our schools? Now I was unable to persuade this reporter that my kids, to whom he was referring, are American kids. They were born in Washington, D.C. There's no us and them in this equation. He couldn't see Latinos as an American constituency. He was really conflating Latinos and immigrants. If he had concerns about immigrants, he wasn't drawing a distinction. And that is really a reflection of how much ground we've lost in the days, even since the 2000 census, that have coincided with a severe heating up of the immigration debate. This is a debate which has huge substantive implications for my community and for the country. It's a debate that we need to get behind us if we're going to deal with these other questions. But really the tensions around immigration are really about two things. The first is a perfectly legitimate policy question. We have an immigration system which is broken. We have a sizable population which has come into this country without inspection and which is living here without the benefit of immigration papers. That's a problem. It's a problem for those immigrants. It's a problem for us as Americans. It's an absolutely legitimate policy question that we have a very big stake in resolving. But it also has to be said that the immigration debate is also a little bit of a referendum on demographic change in this country. That's maybe our heritage as a nation of immigrants. At some level, we are always a little concerned about the groups that are coming. That established groups throughout our history have raised concerns about the groups that were coming. And my organization is really grappling with both of these elements. Our first job is to provide policy alternatives in this debate because we have a great stake in its outcome. And the second job is to remind our fellow Americans that there is no us and them in this debate. This is really a debate about us, and this community's participation in this debate is about who we are as Americans. Our future in this country and the country's future are the same thing. So I'm going to describe a little bit what we're doing to shape the immigration debate. I want to describe a little bit of the policy, and in the course of that, describe a little bit about how we're engaging and how Latino community institutions, along with our partners, are engaging in this debate. And the story of this debate is really a story of how civil society can engage in an important policy question, one of the most pressing domestic policy questions of our time. This debate is largely being driven by people on the pro and anti-immigrant side raising their voices, and by institutions which are both shaping policy and attempting to push it through in a legislative debate. So perhaps the best analogy to describe the way our immigration system is working right now is to describe it as sort of a superhighway. We have an economic phenomenon happening, that we have demand for labor in the United States and the supply of that labor, certainly south of our border and in other developing countries that are nearby. And market forces being what they are, migration results, whether it's under our laws or not, it's happening. And one of the best ways to kind of describe the disconnect in that policy is that it's sort of functioning like a superhighway where the speed limit is set very low. So you end up with a situation where people are speeding. And we spend a lot of our enforcement resources chasing after folks who are violating the law. And when one potential alternative is to set the speed limit a little bit higher, set it in a way that's going to better regulate the flow that's happening. So I'd like to describe just quickly the way the legal system works so that you can get a feel for why people don't come through the legal system but end up coming illegally. There's really three legal ways to enter the United States. The first is as refugees or asylees. These are refugees we resettle deliberately, and those numbers are set through a consultation process every year between the Congress and the administration. And the number of political asylees varies according to the number who come to the U.S. and claim political asylum and have their claims approved. The biggest avenue to come legally is to come as a family-sponsored immigrant. So I, as a U.S. citizen, can petition for close family members. The numbers are roughly about 500,000, a little bit more than 500,000 family-sponsored immigrants come every year. And then the third avenue is as an employment-sponsored immigrant, and those numbers are about 145,000 each year. The family system, which is the biggest system, is very severely backlogged. So I'm just going to quickly tick through the family categories so that you can get a sense of how long people wait to reunite with their closest family members. So USC here means U.S. citizen. As a U.S. citizen, I can sponsor my spouse or my minor children without numerical limitations, which means that those petitions or visas automatically become available. There's no wait there, except for the processing time. And the processing time can be as long as a year. I can also sponsor my unmarried adult children. The average waiting period is 5 years, 8 months for a U.S. citizen to petition for their unmarried adult children. LPR means legal permanent resident. They can also petition for their spouses and minor children. But as you can see, the average wait is 4 years, 9 months. If you're from Mexico or the Philippines, the wait is 6 to 8 years. Unmarried adult children of legal permanent residents wait more than 9 years, almost 10 years, to reunite. Married adult children of U.S. citizens, the average wait is 8 years. And then the final category is brothers and sisters of U.S. citizens. 11 years is the average wait. If you're from Mexico or the Philippines, that wait can be 20 to 25 years. So these are huge backlogs, and they're one of the reasons we have undocumented migration. If you have to wait 6 years to reunite with a spouse, some of those families reunite anyway, and that's part of it's a contributing factor to undocumented migration. The employment-sponsored system is smaller, but it's very important. We have 140,000 visas available every year for so-called high-skilled professions. So if the university is recruiting faculty, permanent faculty, this is where the visa comes from. If a sushi restaurant is recruiting a highly skilled Japanese chef, this is the category that they come to. So you see that most of the visas are available for the so-called high-skilled professions. There are 5,000 visas available in the so-called low-skilled professions, where there is considerable demand for labor. So this is the service sector. This is hotels and restaurants and those kinds of occupations. The number of visas is so small that the waiting list is so long that the category effectively doesn't exist. So if you are an employer and you want to petition for workers from another country, or frankly you have workers working for you that you know are here illegally, there really isn't a mechanism for you to petition for them. So the result is that we have a stream of undocumented immigrants. That's about 400,000 people a year. And that seems to be driven to a certain extent by market forces. I mean, it's very difficult to measure. This is a population which by definition is not getting counted as they come in. But that's the best estimates have it at about 300 to 400,000 a year. So if you're the Restaurant Association, and the Restaurant Association is one of our partners in this debate, the kind of perspective you bring to this debate is that you know that half of your workforce is typically young American workers, right? So in restaurants, certainly if you go to restaurants in Ann Arbor, a big chunk of the folks who are doing the cooking and the waiting tables and the bussing tables are students. And that's about half of the restaurant industry's workforce. The other half, they tell us, is foreign-born. Now, demographically, what's happening to those populations is that the population of young Americans that they can expect to work in the restaurant industry, the best that you can say is that it's stagnating numerically or that it's really declining. So if the restaurant industry is going to grow, as they are predicting they will, the workforce needs to increase from somewhere, and the domestic part of their workforce is not growing, it's shrinking. So they're looking at the foreign-born piece of their workforce. They know that a good chunk of it is here illegally, and they know that that's the portion that needs to grow. So they have a couple of choices in the immigration debate. They could argue for temporary workers, which is a device that many employers use, especially to meet seasonal needs. So that's one option. And the other is to try to find mechanisms to bring in workers permanently. And to their credit, the Restaurant Association hasn't been as tempted by the temporary worker thing. They are arguing, along with us, that we need to provide a legal path for the folks who are already in the workforce, but also create legal mechanisms for folks who will come in the future. So that's one of the reasons that there's a whole sector of the employer community which is very deeply engaged in this debate, and which is sitting at the table with advocates like me and of people from the Roman Catholic Church, for example, who are deeply engaged in this debate, but also with the labor unions who are engaged in this debate. So I sit at an advocacy table with the Restaurant Association and the Hotel and Restaurant Employees Union, which is creates some very interesting dynamics. So whether we like it or not, the undocumented population increases by 350 to 400,000 per year, and we have been attempting to control it really for 20 years. For some reason, years ending in 6 tend to be immigration reform years. A major immigration reform passed in 1986. We passed a second one in 1996. We really thought last year was going to be our year, but apparently not. So 1986, we passed the Immigration Reform and Control Act. The point of IRCA was to stop the flow of undocumented labor, right? So this was the moment at which we had a significant undocumented population, and the point of the law was to try to dry up the job market for undocumented immigrants. And so the real focus of the law was increased enforcement. So we increased enforcement at the border and in the interior, but very importantly in the workplace. So the big innovation of IRCA was that at the time IRCA was passed, it was illegal to be in the country illegally, but it was not illegal to hire someone who was in the country illegally. And IRCA changed that. So if you're in the workforce when you start a new job, you fill out a form called the I-9 form, and that's the employer's way of verifying that you are legally in the United States. IRCA is the law that requires that. And the idea was, if employers are checking everybody's papers, the job market for illegal workers will dry up. And then a third feature of IRCA was this legalization program that was called an amnesty at the time. And about 3 million workers passed through this process and became legal. They're now largely US citizens and indistinguishable from the rest of the population. And the idea was, if we're going to close this back door to undocumented labor, we're going to acknowledge also that there are people who are here and that it doesn't make sense to send them back. And so there was a legalization program associated with IRCA. Well, if IRCA had been successful in stopping the job market for undocumented immigrants, we wouldn't be having this discussion. It obviously wasn't successful. We have a population of about 12 million undocumented immigrants living and working in the US today. It's about 5% of our labor force. And there are lots and lots of implications of having such a sizable population here without their papers. I'm going to focus on a few implications. These are the ones that are most significant for my constituency and my organization. The first of these is a death toll at the border. This didn't used to be true. In the Clinton administration, as part of our investment in securing the border, we embarked on a strategy that was aimed at cutting off illegal entry at the places where it is easiest to cross. So we invested a lot of money, a lot of resources, a lot of technology in the San Diego sector where people could walk across, under the theory that if we made it hard in the places where you could physically cross pretty easily, then people's only choice would be to go to the parts of the border that were really dangerous to cross, and therefore migration would be reduced. Well, half of the theory was right, in that they were able to seal off the San Diego sector. It's very hard to cross there. People are diverted to the more dangerous sectors of the border, but the numbers of people attempting to cross didn't go down. What happened was that the death toll went up. Every year there were always a few deaths, people who drowned in the Rio Grande. But now there's an average death toll of more than one a day. We lose about 400 people a year trying to cross the U.S.-Mexico border. And that's a direct result of two things, our enforcement policy, but also the fact that there isn't a legal mechanism for these folks to enter. So that's one of the side effects of IRCA. A second is because the law failed in 1986, the undocumented population started to grow. And in 1996, Congress passed what is really the harshest enforcement law on record, kind of based on the theory that if we make people's lives as hard as we possibly can, if they're living in the U.S. illegally, then maybe it'll go away. And so this was an incredibly harsh policy, incredible erosions of due process rights. If you are married to a U.S. citizen, for example, and you're an undocumented immigrant, under that family immigration system I described, you should be able to get a visa as the spouse of a U.S. citizen. But under the 1996 law, essentially you can't. The visa is technically available to you, but you can only take advantage of it if you're willing to separate your family for probably 10 years, depending on how long you were illegally in the U.S. So effectively, people can't adjust their status. The avenues from illegal status to legal status were greatly reduced. As a result of the 96 Act. And so the end result of that, sort of perversely, was that the undocumented population grew more and faster because the avenues to go from being undocumented to being documented were essentially eliminated. In addition, because the whole country knows we have an immigration problem, there are some local governments getting into the act. Only Congress can regulate immigration. So if you are the mayor of Hazleton, Pennsylvania, you can't pass an immigration law. So instead what they do is pass housing laws and other kinds of laws that are aimed at dealing with the immigration phenomenon. So Hazleton, Pennsylvania has now made it illegal to rent to an undocumented immigrant, in the hope, again, that the climate will become so hostile that people will go away. Well, if you're a landlord, how are you supposed to determine whether somebody is an illegal immigrant? Right? Who in this room has papers in their wallet that demonstrate their citizenship? Probably not very many of you. I certainly don't. I was born in Detroit. I don't carry my birth certificate, and it's a Xerox piece of paper. I don't know how believable it is anyway. But if you happen to be Latino and you're looking for immigrant looking, and you're looking for housing in Hazleton, Pennsylvania, you're likely to be out of luck, even if you're a U.S. citizen, even if you're native born, because of these kinds of policies. In major sections and highways in the state of Georgia right now, there are roadblocks in place because the local police have gotten in the immigration enforcement business along the same theory, right? That if we round people up, if we make the climate hostile, undocumented immigrants will go away. So if you happen to look Mexican and you're driving down the highway in Georgia, you're very likely to be picked up by these roadblocks. They're only set up for one purpose. And if you can't prove your citizenship, as most of us in this room, I believe, cannot, you're likely to be detained. And in fact, we have examples of people who have been detained for days and even weeks, despite the fact that they are U.S. citizens, because they couldn't prove that to the satisfaction of the local law enforcement. These are big civil rights problems. They largely affect people who appear to be Mexican, because I think people understand the population of undocumented Mexicans to be the biggest segment of the problem. But anybody of foreign appearance or anybody with an accent is affected by this. And it's not a terribly effective way to control for immigration, but it has huge civil rights implications for major groups of Americans. Another result of all of this is community tensions, right? We're having a pretty ugly debate on immigration. Certainly if you watch television news programs, some of the more unsavory shouting programs, you know we're having a very ugly debate. As I described before, that debate has some real implications for how people feel about some of their neighbors. And certainly how some of their neighbors start to feel angry about having to confront things like roadblocks and other kinds of policies like that. So this has real implications for us as a nation of immigrants, as a nation with the kind of diversity that we have. And all of this really stems from the failure of the 1986 policy to control illegal immigration. It's part of the reason that as a constituency, we have a very big stake in how this debate turns out, in substantively whether we're able to produce a policy that controls immigration effectively. So this debate on immigration reform, it has to take place in the Congress. Only Congress can regulate immigration. And it takes shape in one of a couple of ways. I'll describe first some of the elements of that debate, and these elements have really been put together by a coalition of organizations and institutions like my own. There are a bunch of ethnic organizations that are at this table. We sat literally at a table on the Hill drafting legislation with some key legislative offices, particularly Senator Kennedy's and Senator McCain's office. So ethnic organizations were part of this formulation, faith-based groups, especially the Catholic Church, but most of the mainline Protestant denominations, major Jewish organizations, and several key evangelical groups are part of this coalition. As I described, key actors from the business community, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, the Restaurant Association, and others. And some key, very brave labor unions have been part of this network. And the unions which have been part of this network are the unions which have been organizing immigrants and who have decided to break from the traditional labor movement posture of viewing immigrants as a threat to U.S. workers, and concluded that instead of holding immigrants at arm's length, they should be organizing them and sort of turning immigrants into agents of change on wages and workplace conditions and the other things that labor unions work on. Those, coincidentally or not, those are the same unions, by focusing on organizing, who split off from the AFL-CIO and formed the Change to Win coalition. The split wasn't about immigration necessarily, but it was about, to a certain extent, how much you're going to invest in organizing and building the labor movement that way. So it's really the key Change to Win unions who are at this table, particularly the service employees and the hotel and restaurant employers, are really leading the charge. So that grouping, along with some key legislators on both sides of the aisle, came up with a policy formulation for comprehensive immigration reform. And what we want to achieve is something that will work. So the elements, first of all, start with enforcement. You'll see it has the same categories as I described in the debate on IRCA in 1986. There will be increased enforcement at the border and in the interior. But the important piece, again, is the workplace. So IRCA now requires employers to check the documents of everyone they hire. But I think it's pretty well understood that people bypass those requirements by buying false, forged documents. And so the question becomes, how do you then enforce this standard at the workplace? If you believe it is necessary to make it difficult to work in this country if you don't have papers, what's the next step in making this enforceable? Well, the next step has to do with, the direction the debate is going has to do with creating a system which allows employers to comfortably assess the documents that are in front of them and to comfortably believe that they are reliable, right? You don't want employers to be inspecting passports and birth certificates and making determinations about whether they're valid. Every day when we make purchases with merchants, they run our credit card through a system and fairly reliably get information quickly that determines that they're going to get paid for the purchase. The idea is to create a system that functions that efficiently so that when faced with an employee, the employer can determine that they're legally in the U.S., which sounds relatively simple. It is, of course, not at all that simple. The data on the other end of that transaction is government data. You really need to combine data from the immigration authorities, who are notoriously bad record keepers, and the Social Security Administration, which does a much better job of keeping records. But those databases need to be able to talk to each other if employers are going to be able to verify that you, a potential employee, are authorized to work in the United States. And to just give you a sense of how important the quality of that data is, if there's even a 5% error rate, about a couple million Americans every year would be denied the opportunity to work because of bad data. It's obviously unacceptable, and this is the one area of this policy debate which will affect everyone in the U.S. workforce. That piece of the debate isn't just going to affect immigrants, it's going to affect everybody who starts a job in any given year. So the quality of the data on the other end of that transaction is terribly, terribly important. So the policy proposal is to move in that direction, to create a system by which employers can reliably assess that their workers are able to work in the United States. But it importantly includes benchmarks so that, and phase-ins so that we can move forward as the quality of data improves, and to create incentives for the government to improve the quality of the data as quickly as possible. And very importantly, from our perspective, that piece of the proposal needs to include protections so that if there's bad data, next time I'm looking for a job, I can know what's in the database with respect to my records and be able to correct it if there's a problem, and that I don't lose the ability to work as a result of bad data, and the 2 million other people who might lose the ability to work don't face the same problem. So that's where we're heading. And the step after that, which is not yet being raised except in whispers in this debate, but the step after that is an ID card. And for all kinds of reasons, Congress doesn't want to go there yet. But if we do have a national ID card in this country, it will be because of the immigration policy debate. So the second element of a comprehensive immigration reform is to reduce those family backlogs that I described. If people are waiting years and years and years to reunite with family members, there are incentives to just reunite anyway. So there's a substantive reason to be eliminating the family backlogs, but there's also a political reason. If we're going to be doing something about the 12 million people who are here illegally, it doesn't feel fair to be putting them in line in front of people who are waiting years and years for visas. So there's an important political reason as well as a substantive reason to be reducing the family backlog. So that's an essential piece of an immigration reform. The third piece has to do with those 12 million people, and it's the piece which kind of brings us to this debate. And that is a path to citizenship, some kind of legalization program for the people who are here living and working in the U.S. If you ask any good immigration advocate worth their salt whether they support an amnesty, they will tell you, no, we don't. And that's because amnesty has become sort of a poisonous term in this debate. And what we're proposing really doesn't resemble an amnesty. It is the path in the legislation which passed the Senate last year and which has been introduced in the House again last week, essentially allows people to come forward, demonstrate that they haven't committed crimes, that they've been paying taxes, that they've been working, that they're on their way to learning English. They have to pay a fine, and then ultimately they can earn permanent status and ultimately citizenship over time. It takes at least 6 years before they get a legal permanent resident visa. That puts them in line behind the people who were in the family backlogs. And then 5 years after that, they're eligible for citizenship. So it's a good long wait. It involves paying taxes, learning English. And the fine is important. If you go back to my speeding and speed limit analogy, if you're caught speeding and you get ticketed, you pay the fine, and then everybody can move on, right? There's no permanent taint necessarily. That's important in the immigration debate as well. There is this notion we fight against people who say we don't want to be rewarding illegality. And what we're saying is we're not rewarding illegality. We're asking people to earn something, and we're asking them to pay a fine. And then we all need to move on, right? When faced with the real policy options, which are deporting 12 million people, which is unlikely and hugely expensive, and giving those people the ability to earn permanent status and citizenship over time, the American public chooses the legalization path, and that's been demonstrated over and over again in independent polls over the last 5 years. So this, believe it or not, is not the controversial piece of the comprehensive reform debate. This is. So IRCA, the '86 law, combined enforcement with the legalization program. But the whole point of IRCA was to stop the flow of undocumented immigrants and stop the labor market for undocumented workers, and it failed to do that. What we're trying to do now is acknowledge that there is a market for that workforce, and that undocumented immigration in some form is going to continue no matter what we do to try to stop it. And that's really been the experience of the last 20 years. So the '86 law failed. The '96 law tried really hard to make it as miserable as possible to be here illegally. That didn't stem the tide either. So the idea is acknowledge that this is going to happen and regulate it. Set the speed limit at a higher point and give people the ability to come legally so we can inspect them when they arrive. They can come to the jobs that they're coming to anyway, but they'll have rights. They'll be doing it above board. And in an environment where we're all concerned about security and about who may be entering, these people will enter with inspection as opposed to risking their lives in the Arizona desert. This was a really hard piece to arrive at because when President Bush launched into this debate, what he talks about is a guest worker program. Well, we have a lot of history with guest worker programs, and it's not very happy history. The Bracero program from the 1940s, where we had an agreement with Mexico to bring in agricultural workers, is synonymous really with worker abuse. It's not an experience we're interested in repeating. Almost by definition, if you bring in workers temporarily and they have a lesser status, you're inviting exploitation, and That is, in fact, the experience. We have guest worker programs operating now in agriculture. It's called the H-2A program. And, you know, it's not a happy experience. The employers will tell you that the hoops they have to jump through to get the workers are too high. And workers' advocates will tell you that the living conditions and the working conditions are truly horrible. Probably both things are true. For my organization, it was very, very difficult to enter this conversation because we've been opposing guest worker programs for so long. So instead of entering a guest worker conversation, we're trying to reshape it. So we sat down with these brave labor unions that I told you about and the Catholic Church, which also opposes guest worker programs, and said, okay, the status quo is unacceptable, and a guest worker program is unacceptable. Is there an alternative here that we can create that works? Because we've spent the last 20 years stopping guest worker programs. We've accomplished that to a certain extent, except in agriculture. But 400 people a year die crossing the U.S.-Mexico border. We have this undocumented population of 12 million people, and we know they're going to keep coming. So what's the policy alternative? And what we have come up with is to start with a temporary worker model, but to kind of break the guest worker mold and design it differently. So an employer still has to petition for workers and demonstrate that there's a shortage, that they need those workers. But then, when the worker enters, the visa belongs to them rather than to the employer. So if there's an abuse problem, the employee can take the visa and go get another job. Because they're coming in legally, they can organize, they can be parts of unions, they're protected under all of our labor laws. They need to be protected under specific wage provisions, because if you say we're going to bring in temporary workers and they're all covered by the minimum wage, but they end up working in industries that pay $15 an hour, obviously they'd be undercutting the wages of the workers that are already in that sector. So you can't just protect them with minimum wage. You have to make sure that the prevailing wage in any given industry that they're going to work in applies to temporary workers. Otherwise, you're putting them in a position of undercutting the U.S. workforce. So you need visa portability so that they can change employers. You need prevailing wage protections. You need other labor protections. And very importantly, if we're going to do this differently, those workers need to have the ability also to become Americans. Right? So some portion of them will go back and forth across the border. That's the choice that they will make. They can't do that now because it's so dangerous to cross the border. If they survive the trip, they stay here. So there'll be some portion that go back and forth, but there will be some portion that stay. And it's a very critical decision that we make as a nation of immigrants, whether we require that they stay and work but never become Americans, never have an opportunity to make the choice to become Americans. So the temporary worker model that passed the United States Senate last year allows these workers also to earn their way to citizenship over time. And that is essential if we're not going to enshrine a permanent second-class worker for our future in this country. So we think we've reshaped the model. It's not perfect, but we have managed to reshape it in a way with the right partners that we have bipartisan support for a different kind of temporary worker program. Now, there are going to be big fights over the size of this program. President Bush wants it to be traditional guest worker model, and he wants it to be unlimited in size. What we would prefer is that it be a size that can replace the undocumented stream, right? There are 400,000 people coming each year illegally. What we want to do is give those 400,000 people the ability to come legally on a visa rather than crossing the desert on foot, with the protections that I described, so that we replace as much as possible the undocumented stream with people who are coming legally and people who, importantly, have the choice to become U.S. citizens. So the debate is happening. It happened last year. There was a House bill and a Senate bill, and they really reflect different approaches. The House bill was about who can be tougher on immigrants, right? They passed one of the ugliest bills on record. And the Senate approach was this comprehensive approach, and they attempted to shape the debate as being about not who's tough on immigrants versus who's nice to immigrants, but rather who's proposing policy that might actually work. And that's the kind of debate that we're hoping to have. The House, members of the House really attempted to use their tough bill, the Sensenbrenner bill, as a tool in the campaign. And then the theory was the public is really upset about illegal immigration, which is true. And we're going to activate our base by showing them that we're the tough guys and they're the ones who aren't willing to be tough. And three things happened. The first is the response to the Sensenbrenner bill. These are pictures of some of the marches that took place last spring. The Sensenbrenner bill, among the dozens of provisions that would set your hair on fire, would have criminalized undocumented immigrants and criminalized anybody who helps them. And that is the thing which captured everybody's attention. And while the networks that we've been putting in place for years were already planning marches, I think anybody who's being honest with you will tell you we didn't plan that. Right? Over the course of a couple of months, about 2 million people marched in various cities. You're looking at Los Angeles and Chicago, which had some of the biggest marches. But in almost every city where people marched, and there were dozens of them, those marches were the largest marches in those cities' history. In Phoenix, in Dallas, in Memphis, in LA, and all kinds of parts of the country. And those marches had real impact. I'm sure they had a backlash. I'm sure the people who were nervous about demographic change had the tar scared out of them when they saw people marching. But they also had an important legislative impact. Senator Feinstein, in particular, who has never voted with us on an immigrants' rights issue ever in her career, a week before the LA March was a clear vote against legalization, and a week later she voted with us every time, including on legalization. And we used to joke that she had 500,000 reasons to do that. So it did have a legislative impact. I also think it's impossible to understate the impact it had on the community itself. The headline in the Washington Post the day after the big march in DC was, "We decided not to be invisible anymore." And you could see that people knew the country was watching them that day, and they wore their white t-shirts to symbolize peace, and they had their American flags. And the thing that kills me the most is that, it was 500,000 people on the mall in downtown Washington. They cleaned up the mall when they were done. The mall was spotless after this march took place. And that was really about people really wanting to show this country what they're about and how much they have to contribute. And that, we hope, is going to pay real dividends, both because these are people who are participating now and because they made an important statement. So that's one of the things that happened, because the House overreached in its ugly bill. The second is that there was a pretty clear shift in public opinion. So public, which was not so sure it was interested in legalizing people, pretty clearly got it that these are people who want to become Americans, and they got it that we're not going to deport all of these people. And so even people who are not so sure they like them are willing to support giving them a path to citizenship and giving them the ability to earn that status over time. And then the third thing that happened was the elections last year. And the elections are really a story of the dog that didn't bark and the dog that did. So as I mentioned, House Republicans attempted to use this issue in the elections. And there were candidates who ran almost exclusively on this issue, trying to rile up their base in order to win their elections, and they failed dismally. So here's a couple of governor's races where this was attempted very vigorously. It was attempted pretty vigorously in some Senate races where the candidates who tried to do it also lost. And my favorite are the House races, and the Arizona 8th District is maybe the clearest example. Arizona is like the epicenter of this debate. This is where the vigilante group, the Minutemen, was formed. This issue is uglier nowhere than Arizona. And Arizona 8th, the candidate Randy Graff used this issue exclusively in his campaign. And he lost to a candidate who was talking comprehensive immigration reforms. And as many Republican pundits were saying, if this issue didn't work in the Arizona 8th, it's not going to work. And it didn't work. So that's the dog that didn't bark. And the dog that did was the Latino community's vote. And my organization sponsored a poll the weekend just before the election. And we found that a huge proportion of Latino voters, 75%, on a scale of 1 to 10, rated the importance of this election as a 9 or 10. Those are sort of off-the-chart numbers. And then they said that immigration was an important reason that they voted. So if you ask Latino voters what's important to you, they always say education, healthcare, economic status. And that tends to confuse things because then you think, well, then immigration must not be such a big deal. We asked, why are you voting? And half of them said, we're really mad about immigration, about this debate. To address the question of whether all those marchers were actually voters, we asked, did you march or did someone close to you march? And about almost a third, 29%, said that either they or someone close to them marched. But when you asked young voters, it was 45%. Almost half of young Latino voters marched or had someone close to them who marched. So we were able to draw a direct line between those rallies and the Latino electorate. And that electorate voted overwhelmingly Democratic, and I don't think of that as a kind of rushing to the Democrats, but rather away from the Republicans. And the Democrats still have something to prove in this debate. Really, so we're entering a Congress where we think we have a shot at passing immigration reform. It has to be bipartisan. It really has to be comprehensive if it's going to work. Legislation has already been introduced in the House. We're struggling a little more in the Senate, and I'm happy to talk about that when we get to questions if you like. But for us, how we conduct this debate is terribly important. What we're hoping to do is really accomplish two things. One is the policy objectives that I described, and they're terribly, terribly important. It's hard to overstate how important they are. But the other thing is how we conduct ourselves in this debate is going to say a lot about who we are as a community, and is going to answer that question about what we intend to do with the country and with our prominent role that we intend to play in the country. And what we especially hope to do is use those networks that we've been building with labor unions who we didn't used to have relationships with faith-based groups, with the business community, with other ethnic partners within the civil rights community, to make the immigration debate phase one of a multi-phase discussion on really what happens with low-wage workers in this country. So we're hoping that we can build the kind of power and expertise and networks in this debate that can accomplish immigration reform, especially legalization. And then we want to go after wages, and then we want to go after health care, and we want to build the networks that can allow us to do those things. To me, that helps us answer the question, what is it that we really intend? What does it mean that the Latino presence is what it is? If we are amassing political power, how do we intend to use it? The immigration debate has to be answer number one. It does kind of suck up all the oxygen. It does kind of define who we are. But there's a rest of the answer, and the rest of the answer really is about what happens to low-wage workers, what happens in our educational system, and hopefully we can persuade the rest of the country that we're not so bad. So I'll stop there in the hope that we can get a conversation going and have some questions and answers. Thank you.
We are recording this, and I am going to ask if Cecilia calls on you, if you'd go to the microphone to ask your question so that it can be on tape and people know what you're asking. Thanks.
Thanks. Yes, the microphone's right there if you can.
I don't know, it's funny to me to thank you. Okay, that really works. Thanks. I'm Cecilia Muñoz from the Sociology Department, and I also do research on immigration. And I'm very pleased to hear your presentation because it's been very clear and very informative and nice PowerPoint. Nicely done. I do have a comment. I think that whether one calls it a guest worker program or a new worker program is not too critical. I mean, we're talking about the same thing, although, of course, some labels sell better than others. Yeah. But I think that what's really important is the details of the program. And I rely on that hackneyed phrase about how the devil is in the details.
Oh, yes.
We do know a lot, I think, about what happened in the old guest worker program, which was the Bracero program that went on for 22 years, 1942 to 1964. And which was a contract labor program, whatever you end up calling it. I think that people expected, when they got into that Bracero program, the expectation was that it would curb illegality, okay? And instead, the results were that as the number of workers went up, and it was almost 5 million Braceros over the course of 22 years, the number of illegals apprehended also went up, yeah. Okay? To say what I'm saying, I'm relying, I don't like to imagine that this is my data. It's not. It comes from the work of Ernesto Galarza, who did a really classic study way back in 1964.
He's one of my organization's founders.
Yeah, he was a wonderful researcher also, and public policy-minded person. And he did a very good study called Merchants of Labor, subtitled The Mexican Bracero Program and so on. And he was meticulous, painstaking. He went to all the farms in the 90 counties in which the Bracero program serves people in California, and observed, the picking of the particular crops and so on and so forth. And he was able to demonstrate that instead of the Bracero program working as a temporary supplement to the regular labor force, that progressively over time, it led to labor displacement. So that, say, if in 1945, the number of Mexicans who picked tomatoes was 20% and 80% were picked by Native American poor workers. By 1964, it had shifted and it was 80% Mexicans and 20% Americans. And I say that because I think that one of the two important details about the guest worker programs must be done differently, or otherwise we're going to repeat that experience. And ultimately, the U.S. Department of Labor and Congress has ended it because of that labor displacement. And I think the two details are, one is what you call the prevailing wage, okay? There was, in fact, no prevailing wage, or rather there was no minimum wage in agriculture. So the more that Mexicans worked, the more the wage fell. And the more the wage fell, the only people who would take the job were undocumented immigrants, So I think that it's very important that there be a stable wage that has been agreed upon. And I take your point well about how you can't have a minimum wage.
Sylvia, I'm going to ask you to move to a question.
Okay, sorry. Okay, no, I'm making a comment. Okay, and the other detail that I think is also very, very important is the family. Okay, if the braceros, if the guest workers are going to be allowed to come with their families, because if not, as the Germans said, you don't get a worker, you get a human being, and they need their families, and that also leads to illegality. So I think that if you want me to turn this into a question, which it is not, is the new comprehensive immigration reform going to pay attention to these two issues about family?
Well, if we have anything to say about it, the answer is yes. And the good news is that the bill that passed the Senate last year includes prevailing wage protections, and it allows people to come with their families. Now, this year's a whole new Congress, but we built a new bill based on that model, and that's the hope. And I think that the coalition supporting legislation, which has support on both sides of the aisle, is going to insist on those things as bottom line. So I do think that the coalition around a bill falls apart without those kinds of protections. But we have a long road before we pass something. But certainly the wage piece has to be in place, or it's clear that we can't get a bill through. Yes.
My question is regarding whether or not in any of the kinds of conversations that have been going on in the course of debate, that if any attention is given to the consideration of the impact of U.S. economic and political policy on creating some of the motivations for people to come to the U.S. in the first place, and a consideration of the continuing role that that's playing in creating the sorts of challenges that migrants are faced with when they're making the decision of whether or not to even come to the U.S. to begin with. So.
I wish I could tell you that the answer to that question was yes, but it's not. There are a couple structural reasons that the question of our interactions abroad don't play into the immigration debate. One is that for immigration legislation to move forward, it's under the jurisdiction of the Judiciary Committee in the Congress, which does domestic stuff and not international stuff. And so the committees with jurisdiction over foreign affairs, over foreign aid, over those kinds of issues are not engaged in the immigration debate. And so that creates a structural reason that they're separate. But the other structural reason is really institutional. That the constituencies that are engaged around immigration, with the possible exception of the faith-based constituencies, are not explicitly not engaged in international policy. And the reason that an organization like mine isn't engaged in international policy has to do with what I described at the beginning, where people already think we're foreign agents, and we have to do backflips to demonstrate that we're Americans, and that the government that we're trying to lobby and influence is our own government in the United States. And so our history is to limit our interactions with the Mexican government and with foreign governments, because people already assume that we're their agents. And we kind of hold them more at arm's length in order to accomplish a civil rights agenda. And the outcome of that is that there isn't really a constituency that's having that conversation, which is, what is the economic development conversation to be had that can affect migration? If there is a constituency for it, it's a different constituency, and it's not connecting up to the immigration debate, which is a huge loss. It's as if the only thing that matters in immigration policy is what happens in the U.S., and obviously that's only half the picture. Yes, sir.
There's a mic. There's a microphone behind you.
Yeah, thank you. I was wondering if your organization gave any thought to or had any program that would deal with the question of why it is that the nations that supply the immigrants don't do a better job of giving their citizens enough work.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question, and it's related really to the previous question. It's not, so the supply of immigrants isn't necessarily a direct result of government policy in countries like Mexico or other countries, but it's obviously a byproduct of economic conditions. And neither we, we as advocates nor as a government, we don't engage in the conversation about the conditions that drive people to migrate. And that's it's obviously a very important part of the equation, and it's one that within the United States we're not dealing with very effectively.
I mean, right now, most of the things that the U.S. does tend to push people out of their home country. I mean, especially
Yes.
our agricultural policy. Couldn't your organization do something about that?
Well, the best example is probably the debate over the North American Free Trade Agreement. And the argument that got made was that free trade between the United States, Canada, and Mexico was going to advance development in those countries and reduce migration. And of course, it's had the opposite effect. Yes, sir.
Given the fact that the Rosaro program really didn't stand by illegal immigration, and the current illegal immigration, I mean, immigrants face horrific conditions coming, and working conditions are, clearly miserable. If you open up a guest or new worker program, do you expect that to really impact the level of illegal immigration, or will it just continue to encourage it?
Well, the honest answer is that what we're proposing is an experiment, right? We are proposing to replace undocumented migration with roughly the same numbers of people, but who would come legally under a different set of conditions. And I mean, an honest assessment is that we don't know whether that will work. It is to be hoped that given the opportunity to get a visa that comes with those kinds of protections, that the rational choice will be to opt for that visa rather than cross the desert on foot. And that some number of people will do that. We are hoping to replace the undocumented stream with a regulated stream as much as possible. But we haven't tried this in this way, and so we don't really know whether that's going to be the effect. Yes?
So I want to push you on this question a little further, because it seems to me that one thing that limits illegal immigration to the U.S. now, and it doesn't limit it very well, is that if you can't cross a border, your only other way of getting into the country illegally is to get a valid visa, like a tourist visa, and then overstay. And as you know, some of the numbers suggest that about a third of the illegal population isn't coming across the border, they're coming on overstays. But there are a lot of people in the world who, for one reason or another, can't get a tourist visa or wouldn't want to overstay, and so they don't come to the U.S. If you open up a legal path, then it seems to me that there are people around the world who are not currently coming illegally, who, given the option of a legal path, would choose to apply for those visas. And so the story isn't that there are 400,000 people now who want to come, let's give them an opportunity to come legally. It's that once you open up the gate, then the supply increases as well.
And that could well be a result. I mean, the truth is that we don't know. We think some of the demand that we suspect is out there is also created by the backlogs in the family system. There are millions of people in those backlogs. So that, we think, is a piece of it. But there are additional pieces that we're struggling to address through policy formulations. It's very difficult to calibrate immigration policy to labor policy, for example, right? So we struggle with what are the labor market tests that you need in order to determine whether you really need immigrant workers. And that doesn't begin to address the question of how do you match whatever we calculate our demand to be with the potential supply. So none of these are going to be perfect solutions. We can certainly do better than we're doing. And the goal is if we can reduce the stream of undocumented migration significantly, we'll have, you know, a different set of situations that our next immigration reforms will be prepared to grapple with. Yes.
My question was related to the family backlog. And you mentioned 5 to 10 years for reuniting families. In some sense, I mean, I think this is the stream of immigration you want to encourage, because these are people who would have family members to depend on should they become unemployed for a month or 2 or 6 months, and then you know, they have you know, family members that are going to encourage them to learn English as quickly as possible, things like that. What is the reason for the current backlog? Is it just, you know, administrative, or is it punitive, or whatever? And is it realistic in terms of the program that you're supporting to say that we could get that backlog reduced and the time frame reduced?
It's a good question. The policy that we proposed eliminates the backlog in 6 years, and importantly, the people who would be legalizing from being undocumented don't get access to permanent visas until after 6 years. So that's how we can say people who are in line already are in line in front of people who are undocumented. And the reason for the backlogs is that we have numerical limitations. So there's except for that first category for spouses and minor kids of U.S. citizens, every other category has a number associated with it, and we can't go past that number in allocating visas. And then on top of that, there's a maximum for any individual country, so that any individual country can't send more than you know, a certain number. That's why you end up with the backlogs for Mexico and the Philippines being higher than backlogs for other countries, because there's more demand and they bump into their country limits as well as the numerical limitations. Yes.
Hi, sorry. You mentioned the prevailing wage and the portability of the visas. My question is on kind of unintended consequences of this to avoid the second-class citizen. On an individual level, what kind of protection or enforcement do you envision to ensure that on a personal level there's no, you know, people are going to know who these workers are and are likely to discriminate?
Well, we have, unfortunately, a labor law system which is a claims-based system. So even if you have labor protections on the books, you really only access them if you decide to file a complaint. And we have a Department of Labor which is sufficiently underfunded that they don't really have a lot of people going around the country helping respond to complaints. So, you know, one challenge is getting the right labor protections in the Act, and the second challenge is making sure that they're enforceable and that they're vigorously enforced. And right now they depend on somebody having the chutzpah to step forward and complain and stick with a case. And so part of this conversation, part of the reason that, you know, the rest of the labor unions are so skeptical that even with this lovely set of protections we can make this work, is because they're pretty cynical, and rightly so, about our willingness as a nation to enforce any labor laws that are on the books. And, you know, we obviously can't fix all of American labor policy through our immigration laws, but it means that, again, the coalitions and the constituencies who are engaged in this piece of the debate have to be part of the constituency to fight for vigorous enforcement of labor laws and for a system that's a little bit more effective than the one we have now. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, I'm Carol Kahn, Public Health Nurse with Washtenaw County, and if I seem a little emotional, it's because this issue is very, very emotional for me. I work every day with the Latino community in our county, and I'm seeing the desperation of these families. I work with the Maternal Infant Health Program, and one of our mandates is to try and reduce the birth rate by use of birth control. And the illegal immigrants cannot access our state-sponsored system, which pays for birth control at the present time, because they don't have Social Security numbers or legal documents. And the birth control rate is going up, up, up in this population. I'm very concerned for the next 10 years or so when these kids start trying to get into our schools, special ed, all that stuff. Our schools are going to be seriously in serious trouble. Parents don't have access to literature. They're unable to read in their own Spanish language. We've got issues of literacy, let alone the ability to begin to speak English language. We have a backlog here in our ESL classes. People can't access ESL easily. Lack of transportation, lack of food. Our state Department of Human Services
does not offer services bilingually. Protective services mandated to protect children in our county, our state, does not offer bilingual services. So I'm very concerned, I'm very fearful, yet I'm very grateful that I'm not going to be prosecuted today for helping Latinos. So thank you for being here.
Thank you. So this raises this whole other question, whether or not we have undocumented migration. We have significant levels of immigration, right? Numerically, they're as high as they were, in the early part of the 20th century. They're smaller as a proportion of the U.S. population, but they're not small numbers. And we, you'll notice we're having a conversation about control. We're not having a conversation about integration. We've been talking about this in my class, this notion of what are we investing in as a society to help immigrants make the leap to becoming Americans? And the answer is we're not making that investment at all. We count on their families to help them. We count on communities to do it. And we actually do remarkably well with no investment at all, in that immigrants do integrate. They do ultimately learn English. Their children are generally bilingual. Their grandchildren generally have lost the first language altogether. We get a lot for nothing. But imagine what we could do if we were actually investing, as the progressive movement did in the 20th century, in the early part of the 20th century, when the public library system was created as an immigrant integration strategy, and the public school system was created as an immigrant integration strategy. We're not doing any of that kind of thinking now. We're mostly criticizing immigrants for our perception of their failure to integrate. Yes. Yeah, this is the last one.
Great. I guess along the same lines, to talk about success, I do a lot of work with Latino student populations, more along the high school level, middle school level, and so a lot of these students aren't struggling, they're actually excelling. Outstanding grades, outstanding course selection, outstanding ACT scores. But when they graduate from high school, they reach a situation where they have no options, or very limited options. I know this comprehensive immigration reform is like a first step, but I'm wondering in the first step or in subsequent steps, is there any plans to incorporate a plan to get these? I mean, you mentioned that there's a 5-year in a pathway to citizenship. There's like a 5-year for legal permanent residence. That means students graduating, once this bill passes, if it passes, will have to wait 5 years before they can attend this institution. I hear things like the DREAM Act, which would give in-state tuition to students, but in-state tuition at the University of Michigan's $17,000 for room and board included, and I don't know too many immigrant populations that can afford $17,000 to go to an institution like the University of Michigan. So I guess my question, to give you a question, is there any work being done to create access for higher education for these populations?
Yes, right. So the DREAM Act is piece one, and what the DREAM Act does is deal with undocumented students. These are children who came as infants, brought by their parents. They've grown up here. They're effectively American kids. They don't remember the country that they came from. But the door kind of gets slammed shut when they graduate from high school because they can't qualify for financial aid or for in-state tuition. The DREAM Act allows them to qualify for financial aid and in-state tuition and provides them with a path to citizenship, and that's likely to be part of a comprehensive reform. It was part of the Senate bill last year. So this is part of the reason that I say we have to get immigration off the table, because we're actively engaged in a conversation on education, both on the quality of education that our kids are receiving in the public schools, where we have the highest dropout rate in the country, and also access to higher ed. But in order to engage that conversation effectively, we need to move past the immigration debate because it sucks up all the oxygen. Thank you very much.
Thank you to Cecilia for her time and for all the work she's doing. Thank to all of you for coming today. I invite all of you to join us for a reception outside in the Great Hall just through those doors.